Sell your cabin in 48 hours or else. That's what the paper said, word for word, like a line from a bad movie villain. Only this wasn't a movie. It was my Saturday morning, my kitchen, my coffee barely whispering to a boil. And some self-appointed ruler of the block had decided to run my life with a sheet of paper shoved under my door while I slept. I laughed when I read it, but not because any of it was funny. Because the audacity of it was so shocking I had nothing else left in my toolbox at 6:30 in the morning. Then I read it again. And again. The longer I stared at 48 hours to sell your cabin, the more surreal it felt, until the absurdity gave way to a nauseating anger. If you've ever had a moment where reality tilts and you aren't sure if you're the crazy one or the only rational person in the room, you'll understand the sensation. I'm not new to paperwork wars. 20 years in insurance taught me how to read property law, how to find the clause everyone else ignores, and how to survive whoever shouts the loudest. And here's what I knew before I even finished my first cup of coffee. No homeowners association, no HOA president, no board member, not even a gleaming stack of official stationery, can force a resident to sell their property. Not in Michigan. Not anywhere I've ever worked. This wasn't enforcement. This was harassment. I set the notice on my kitchen table, took a slow breath, and went to the closet for the wooden document box I keep for when life gets noisy. Inside, beneath survey maps and closing documents, was the paper I needed, the easement agreement for the utility corridor that runs beneath my cabin and from there out to the marina, clubhouse, and common areas. Our HOA has permission to run lines underground through my property for household use. Household. Not anything they feel like. Not public revenue stream disguised as neighborly amenities. A clause in Section 12, subsection B had stuck with me when I reviewed it years ago, and it blazed a hole in the page as I read it again. Any for-profit activity using corridor lines requires immediate reclassification and rate adjustment. Business service. Different rates. Different rules. Under Michigan law, if you turn residential utility into a commercial operation, you change the classification and the cost. Triple in many cases, retroactive to the first day of use. That clause had always seemed like one of those academic complexities no one would bump into. Suddenly, it wasn't theoretical. It was a loaded spring. Footsteps creaked across my back deck. I looked up to see a familiar IBEW cap in the window. Harris Martinez. He lives 2 cabins down. Licensed electrician. The human map of every power line in our community. He knocked gently as I opened the door. Morning, Colby. Your lights were on early. Everything all right? I handed him the notice without a word. He whistled low through his teeth. 48 hours? To sell? That's nowhere near legal. I found something, I said, laying the easement agreement on the table. Do you remember when they installed those EV chargers at the marina last month? Harris's expression stiffened. Yeah. Why? Are they open to the public? He thought a moment. Saw tourists swiping credit cards last night. The kiosks went live a couple weeks ago. That was all I needed to hear. I slipped into my jacket. Harris, I need to see them up close. We walked the gravel path to the marina, fog lifting off the lake in thin threads. The chargers were hard to miss. 3 glossy pedestals, bright screens, payment terminals facing the road like bait. A timer box was wired to the main feed. Harris pointed to it. That flips them to public mode at 11 p.m. Back to private at 6 a.m. They built their own violation into the system. I took pictures of everything. Timer settings. Payment kiosks. The sign that declared, public charging available, with an arrow pointing toward the lot. Every image was a nail. Under Michigan law, public access plus payment equals business use. And business use flips a lot of switches, none of them cheap. Do you have the right to check deeper? I asked. Harris nodded. Licensed safety inspections override property restrictions. If it's wired and serving the public, it falls under state safety. He lifted the panel, clipped his meter leads, and rattled off numbers while I filmed. Current draw clocking steady overnight. That's a commercial signature. Homes spike evenings. Businesses hum while regular people sleep. A security guard wandered over, chin raised like he'd practiced in a mirror. This is private property. You can't be here. Harris didn't look up. State safety inspection, he said, showing his license. Michigan code requires access for verification. The guard mulled that over, pressed his radio, and someone in his ear told him to stand down. We kept working. Within 20 minutes, we had load readings, transaction logs, timestamps. Harris coaxed the hidden menu on each charging station to print a list of payments. Over 200 transactions in 2 weeks. Different card numbers. Gateways set to imprint a merchant code for electric service. I watched the pages spew from his little portable printer and imagined a courtroom jury flipping through them while someone tried to call minor charges what was clearly a steady revenue stream. By 9, I was back at my table with a gallery of proof. The timer. The signs. The way the kiosks were angled to catch eyes from passing cars. And those logs, clean, undeniable, organized money. The HOA had turned a community power line into a business. My easement, residential only, was the artery feeding it. The phone rang. Colby, it's Trevor Holt. Our treasurer's voice always had a tightness to it, as if the ledger book were a little too heavy for his lap spine. I heard you got some kind of notice this morning. Denise's sale demand? Yeah. Did you know about it? Long pause. I handle the books. Denise handles enforcement. Enforcement. That word used to mean noise complaints and paint colors. Now it sounded like code for nightlife intimidation. Trevor, I said, switching to the tone you use when you already know the answer, do you realize for-profit activity voids residential authorizations? Silence again. I don't know what you mean. His voice said otherwise. Documentation beats argument. That's what insurance work taught me. I emailed everything to the utility company's reclassification team with a summary referencing my easement, the unit's public hours, the payment logs, and Section 12, subsection B. An hour later, a reply landed like a hammer. Mr. Mercer, based on your evidence, we are scheduling an emergency inspection for Monday morning. If commercial activity is confirmed, reclassification will be immediate. Monday morning. Less than 24 hours away. Every automated swipe they processed now was digging the hole deeper. I took a breath, packed my folder, and headed to the clubhouse. Denise's pickup sat out front, red, loud, and parked at an angle to own more than one spot. Trevor's sedan melted into the background nearby. Inside, Denise perched at the head of the table, clipboard held tight like a weapon. Trevor hunched in the chair beside her, ledger open, sweat already greasing the page edges. Colby, Denise said, her voice sugar over ice. We need to discuss your property situation. I sat. Set my folder flat. Actually, we need to discuss yours. Her lips compressed. Excuse me. I slid the 48-hour notice toward her and kept my voice steady. HOA presidents can't order property sales under Michigan law. This is harassment. If we were being charitable, we'd call it ignorance. But given what I've documented, we can't be charitable. Trevor's knee tapped under the table like a drum. He knew where this was going. I placed the photo of the sign, public charging available, beside the payment logs. 200 outside payments in 2 weeks, taken at kiosks advertised to the public. That strips your residential coverage completely. Denise leaned back, chin up. Those are minor charges. Hardly commercial. I pulled out my phone and dialed a number that still sat in muscle memory. Midwest Property Insurance Claims, please. After a small eternity, someone I'd worked with for years picked up. Colby. It's Sarah from underwriting. What's going on? I put her on speaker and set the phone between us. Sarah, hypothetically, if an HOA runs commercial activity under a residential policy, what happens to the coverage? Her answer had blade edges. The moment it turns commercial, the policy is void. Backdated to day 1. Any damages in that window are uninsured. Liability shifts personally to decision-makers. Trevor inhaled sharply. Denise's eyes shot to the phone as if it had bitten her. Thank you, I said. I ended the call and spread out one more page. A photograph, taken by Harris, of the installation permit stamped 20 years ago. The words, residential, only glowed red in the flash. This is what you signed, I said. This is the rate you're paying. You don't get to run a public business on a household permit. Not in this state. Trevor closed his ledger slowly, hands shaking. Denise, we need to shut the stations down immediately. She snapped. We need that revenue. The budget is strained. Revenue doesn't help when you're gambling with personal liability and insurance fraud. We held eye contact. She was daring me to blink. I didn't. The next day didn't let me rest. At 6 a.m., my phone buzzed with a text from the utility company confirming the time for Monday's reclassification inspection. 30 minutes later, my neighbor from 3 cabins down called. Colby, mind if I come by? Heard you had some trouble with the HOA. By 8, a half-circle of neighbors sat on my deck with steaming mugs of coffee and the kind of tight faces people make when worry has eaten their sleep. Mrs. Patterson, widowed, white hair fastened back in a clip, hands trembling from both age and anger, stood with difficulty and held up a crumpled notice identical to mine. 48 hours to sell, she said, voice threaded with fear. Said my fence is 6 inches too high. Said they'll cut my electricity if I don't comply. The air went cold. No one touches an elderly resident's power. Not in my hearing. Not in Michigan. How many of you got these? I asked. 4 hands rose. 4 flimsy violations. 4 threats. Harris arrived carrying his old film camera and a stuffed envelope of photographs and permits. He spread them across the table, archive images from when the utility lines were laid under my property to serve the marina and clubhouse 2 decades ago. Each shot bore the state seal and a bright stamp that said residential only. The permit language hasn't changed in 20 years, he said. Commercial activity was never allowed. Jim, a retired teacher, pushed his glasses up and leaned in. So Denise knew this when they installed the chargers. Harris didn't smile. The permit is public record. Any board member could have checked before authorizing a business. Then Mrs. Patterson delivered the line that turned my stomach to stone. She told me non-compliance could affect my property insurance, she said. Said insurance companies don't cover homes in violation of community standards. The wrongness of it was so complete I could feel my heartbeat in my throat. I hit record on my phone. Mrs. Patterson, say that again. She repeated it while the oxygen concentrator in the corner hissed its steady measure of life. Jim thumbed quickly through his phone, searching Michigan statutes. Cutting someone's power requires 30 days written notice and a lawful cause, he said. They can't just threaten you. And HOAs don't control utility services. That's pure intimidation. Looked around the deck and saw something shift. Anger shared beats anger suffered. And this wasn't just my fight anymore. Here's what we're doing, I said. We document every threat, each false claim, all harassment. We compile it with the photos and the logs and we file with state authorities, the utility company, and the insurer. We stop dealing with bluffs and start dealing with law. Harris lifted his camera. I'll handle the technical record. We'll map the lines, record the loads, print the transactions. Jim opened a notebook. I'll pull the relevant statutes and draft complaints. We'll cite everything. Mrs. Patterson tapped her notice flat with determination. I'll talk to the quiet ones who are still afraid. No one sits alone in their cabin wondering if they're next. By lunchtime, our little lakeside community had a plan and, more importantly, a backbone. The HOA president had turned neighbors into witnesses. Witnesses bring law. At 2 a.m, my phone yanked me awake with a motion alert from a security camera pointing at the utility corridor behind my cabin. I slid from bed and peered through the back window. A figure crouched at the junction box. A glint of metal caught the dying moonlight. Wire cutters. No licensed technician shows up at 2 a.m. No licensed technician wears their hair like that, too familiar, too defiant. The angle of the shoulders was unmistakable. Denise. I called Harris. Get here now. Bring your camera. She's tampering with live lines. He arrived in 5 minutes flat. We moved through the pines, staying out of sight. Denise yanked and pried, spark spitting, metal scraping. She had no idea what she was cutting and didn't seem to care. Then the utility's safety system screamed. Sirens ripped through the pre-dawn dark. Red strobes strobed on every corner. Backup systems roared like a low storm. Dogs barked in a chain reaction. Porches lit up like dominoes. It felt less like a neighborhood dispute and more like a scene from a disaster drill. Within minutes, a utility truck screeched into view. 2 technicians hit the ground, reflective strips glowing, insulated tools in hand. Denise staggered back like a child caught with a lighter near drapes. "Ma'am, step away from the electrical equipment," the lead tech shouted. "You're in violation of Michigan safety codes." She tried a line she must have rehearsed in the mirror. "As HOA president, I have authority over utilities." The tech laughed once. "Ma'am, HOA presidents have zero authority over electrical infrastructure. What you did constitutes criminal tampering." The sheriff's cruiser slid in behind the utility truck. Then a second truck. A fire engine. A supervisor's SUV. Uniforms flowed around the junction box like a wall. Harris showed his license, rattled off his professional assessment, and handed over photographs. I passed my security footage to the deputy. Denise stood in the middle holding a dead pair of cutters, flipping from defiance to panic and back again like a switch stuck in a bad circuit. "Mrs. Benson," the deputy said in a voice even sharper than the strobe lights, "you are under arrest for criminal mischief, utility sabotage, and endangering public safety." They cuffed her without ceremony. In the distant glow of cabin windows, neighbors watched in pajamas, arms wrapped around themselves against the chill, some recording, some just staring, everybody learning exactly where the line sat. By dawn, crews had replaced the ground wires she cut and checked every critical connection. The lead inspector handed me an incident report and shook his head. "I've seen careless," he said. "This wasn't careless. This was sabotage mixed with incompetence. That combination kills people." I watched the last of the strobes fade into pale morning and thought about Mrs. Patterson's oxygen machine. About the medication fridge with its quiet hum. About the number of devices one surge could fry. The stakes were no longer theoretical. They became even less theoretical when, later that morning, Denise, out on bail, sent a notice from jail to Mrs. Patterson threatening to cut her service if she continued supporting legal action against HOA management. I read it at Mrs. Patterson's kitchen table with my hand on the back of her chair to keep myself from punching a hole in her cupboard door. The phrasing was bureaucratic ice. Immediate power disconnection. Medical equipment exemptions do not apply to non-compliant properties. It was the first time I have ever, without any hesitation, called the police and used the words criminal endangerment. Detective Morrison answered on the second ring and told me flatly they would be pursuing additional charges. He did not sound like a man confused about where the line sat either. While I was on the phone, Trevor appeared in the doorway. He looked like he hadn't slept in 3 days. For once, he didn't carry that ledgery nervousness. He carried something that looked like shame. "Mrs. Patterson," he began quietly, "I owe you an apology." He placed his ledger on the table and opened it to a page with too many checks in too short a column. "She used HOA funds to hire private investigators and process servers to intimidate residents," he said. "I signed off thinking it was legal defense. I was wrong. Threatening someone's medical equipment isn't management. It's attempted murder. I'm resigning and turning over all records to authorities." Sometimes you can feel a spine grow in a person. I saw it happen in Trevor's shoulders. At the marina that afternoon, Denise tried one last desperate maneuver, waving cash at 3 contractors to remove the charging stations before the inspectors arrived. The contractors took one look at Harris's camera, another at the crime tape, and packed their tools in under a minute. "Ma'am," the lead said, "we don't destroy evidence. Not for triple. Not for 10 times triple." Allison Brooks from State Utility Compliance arrived Friday morning with an army. State inspectors. Insurance investigators. Disability rights officials. Law enforcement. It wasn't quiet justice. It arrived like a parade with flashing IDs and clipboards. You could feel neighbors exhaling as the cars rolled past my deck one by one. Allison wore her authority without swagger. "Mr. Mercer, thank you for your thorough documentation," she said, flipping through the folder I had prepared and cross-checking it against what Harris and I gave her earlier in the week. "We rarely see this degree of systematic permit abuse. We'll be reclassifying your corridor as commercial service, retroactive, pending verification. 3 hours later, verification wasn't a question. It was a stack of forms and signatures. Commercial reclassification. Retroactive charges. The HOA's electric bill would triple for community areas feeding off my easement. The back bill for 3 weeks of greed sat at $23,000. No budget coughs that up without choking. Sarah from Midwest Property Insurance arrived with 2 colleagues and an expression like a verdict. Operating commercial activity under a residential policy constitutes deliberate misrepresentation, she said, handing Trevor a cancellation notice. Coverage is void from the first day of business use. Board members may be personally liable for damages in the uninsured period. The words fell heavy, and you could almost hear the sound of denial cracking. Detective Morrison followed with cuffs for round 2. Mrs. Benson, you are under arrest for criminal harassment, insurance fraud, elder endangerment, evidence tampering, and utility sabotage. Federal disability rights officials took over after that, charging her with threatening life-sustaining medical equipment under federal protection statutes. Her lawyer paled at the word federal like he'd just realized his client wasn't negotiating fines. She was negotiating years. That afternoon, we held a community vote at the clubhouse to remove Denise from every board position and bar her from serving in the future. The room was full. The energy was not fear. It was exhaustion, yes, but also something like vindication. Mrs. Patterson stood to speak, oxygen hissing softly by her chair as she told everyone exactly what had been sent to her and how close the line had been to truly mortal wrongdoing. People applauded like they hadn't in years, for a neighbor, but also for themselves. Allison returned to hand me the final utility documents. Your cabin remains residential, she said. Only the community feed through your easement carries commercial classification. Translation: my bill stays the same while the HOA soaks the reclassification. Justice with symmetry. I walked down to the marina and looked at the kiosks that had started this whole mess. They stood dark now, tagged as evidence. The public access sign had been removed. No hum from the timer box. No lure for tourists. Silence carries a different tone when it arrives on the heels of noise built on lies. Back at the bulletin board by the clubhouse, I pinned 2 sheets side by side, the fake 48-hour sale notice and the official reclassification order. 1 bluff. 1 fact. Let everyone see the difference. HOA harassment didn't win this round. Property rights, documentation, and law did. Michigan law on utility reclassification did. Insurance law on misrepresentation did. Federal disability law did. We learned a lot in a few long days, that you can't run a business in disguise and expect nobody to read the fine print, that threatening elderly neighbors' power is a line that will bring agencies you don't want at your door, that neighbors who usually keep their heads down will stand up when you touch life and home at once. That night, Harris and I sat on my deck with Mrs. Patterson, watching the lake carry the last of the evening light into the trees. She brought cookies. He brought the film camera, even though the job was done. I brought nothing but a kind of quiet relief. Thank you, she said, looking at both of us but also, I think, at the whole neighborhood. For protecting not just my equipment, but all of us. The phone rang one last time, billing from the utility company. Mr. Mercer, the rep said, your personal account remains residential. The HOA's community account is commercial and back-billed as of reclassification. Thank you, I said. I hung up and laughed once, not out of mockery but the kind of laughter that slips out when tension finally releases. The numbers evened. The laws worked. The threats didn't. At the end of our boat dock, I pulled the illegal sale notice from my pocket and smoothed its creases with my thumb. 48 hours to sell your cabin. Failure to comply will result in legal action. They were right about one thing. Legal action did follow. They just miscalculated who it would bury. If you've ever been handed a demand that hits like a punch, don't forget to reach for your documents and your neighbors. Laws matter when you place them beside the bullhorn. Paper bullies don't survive daylight. And as any electrician will tell you, grounding matters most when the voltage spikes.